Hi BookTube, and welcome to another fiction review. Today we're going to look at a novel that deals somewhat with time travel, but it isn't written by an author that you would expect to cover such a topic. Today we are reviewing The House on the Strand by Daphne du Maurier, published in 1969, 307 pages. The Amazon prices that I've shown on the slide here, they're indicative of the cheapest copies I could find. You can find all kinds of copies. Obviously, given the age of this book, there are copies that will be more expensive because they've been signed or their first editions, etc. If you're looking for rare books, there will be more searching needed. But I'm more interested in talking about why I read this book, why I chose it. It is owned, but strictly speaking, owned by the person who watches television, who read it some years ago, and I was surprised that they read it and found it so pulling and got through it so easily. I didn't expect that from what I would call a general fiction novel. It's always a bit iffy whether the person who watches television will be excited, will be drawn to a general fiction or literary fiction novel. And so I'd always wanted to read it. And then when I was putting together the Secret Santa tag with Meg from Books Off the Beaten Path, I mentioned, one of the books I was thinking of getting you was Daphne du Maurier's The House on the Strand. And she said, I already own it and I really want to read it. I said, well, I own it. I really want to read it. So what does that come out to? A buddy read, of course. Now, not entirely sure when Meg's video is going to come on YouTube. It could be there already because I'm not looking at YouTube right now. I'm just filming. If she's got her video up, then I will link to it. Trying to think how I would summarize this book. I was going to put science fiction in the genre box, and then I thought, do I honestly think The House on the Strand could be called science fiction? It doesn't explain its science, and I must admit that myself, not a scientist, nevertheless, the book was kind of straining credibility from me. But there are elements of the story which would need scientific explanation. The author is speculating about a possible invention that might affect the human brain. So yeah, I believe readers of science fiction, if you can suspend disbelief easily and you don't need to feel that you understand the science behind the story necessarily, I think you'll be fine. I feel like du Maurier maybe wrote this book more for historians to be sympathetic with than for scientists. A little introduction to our author, Daphne du Maurier, or to give her full name. Strictly speaking, she should be called Dame Daphne du Maurier, Lady Browning, DBE. DBE meaning Dame of the British Empire. But her feelings about receiving that honor in 1977 were mixed. She didn't tell her family. Apparently her children found out when they saw it on the television news, and then they had to contact her and persuade her to actually attend the ceremony at Buckingham Palace. She was born in 1907 in London, and she's probably one of the last women to have a home-based education with a governess or governesses, followed by a finishing school in Paris. And then her first publication in 1931 was The Loving Spirit, and her last publication in 1972 was a novel, sadly, that didn't get good critical reception, and that was Rule Britannia. Du Maurier was never a writer who enjoyed the attention that fame brought, and that's probably why this little potted biography looks sparse. It's not easy to find much about her online. But in addition to her novels, I'll also say Daphne du Maurier wrote plays. One of them was a stage adaptation of her best-selling book, Rebecca. Setting is what we need to deal with next. We are in Cornwall in England, and so for all you non-UK viewers, I'm now going to show you a series of maps to kind of help you get oriented. First, here we are, we're looking at Cornwall circled on a map of England. So we're in the far southwest, that funny little almost pointing finger bit coming out of the south of England. Now I'm going to zoom in, and what you're looking at now is just a map of Cornwall with the area around Par and Fowey where the novel is set. That's circled. And finally, we're going to zoom in even more to just that little area. And you'll see that these days it is very built up, much more than it would have been in 1969 when the novel was written. This is the map, finally, that was in my paperback version, showing how the area differed between the 20th and the 14th century. So what you can see there is in the 14th century, there was a much greater incursion of the sea coming inland. You can see the hashed areas showing where the water came inland more than it does presently. By far, the most important thing about the setting is time travel. If you like your science fiction, as I said before, to get down to the mechanics of the science in detail, how the heck does it work, this novel only hints at it. And I had to decide early on that I was just going to suspend my disbelief, because the scenario, I didn't feel it would have been scientifically plausible even in 1969. And at any rate, my impression was that Daphne du Maurier wasn't really interested in formulating a theory of time travel. What she uses is more of a device, a narrative device, which would allow her to show you Cornwall as it is and Cornwall as it was. I think she was more interested in celebrating that part of England because she became very attached to that part of England. She became a member of the Cornish Nationalist Party, which still exists, and it campaigns for greater self-government in the county. Our narrator for this novel, because it is first-person narrated, is Richard Young. He's English, he's a graduate of Cambridge University, and he spent 20 years working in publishing. I couldn't say exactly how old he is, but of course, to say that you've been working in publishing for 20 years, I figure that puts him somewhere between 45 and 50. He became a married man only 3 years before the novel opens. And he describes the first 12 months of that marriage as impulsive and passionate. When we get the story beginning, the temperature of that relationship is changing. Richard is between jobs as well. His wife is American. Now, she would really, really like for the two of them now to relocate from their home in London to New York. And her brother conveniently has a position in his publishing company that Richard could fill. But Richard, he hasn't said no to that, but he hasn't said yes either. Regarding the rest of the characters, the number of, initially I thought I needed to write down the names of the characters who appeared in the time travel segments of the book because their relationships were complicated. I wrote them all down and I included some explanatory details for myself, and then I never referred to the notes again. Now, my copy of the book has a family tree, but I found that a bit confusing because it included names of people who don't actually appear as characters in the novel. They're ancestors of the characters in the novel or descendants of the characters in the novel. And of course, in times gone by, people used fewer first names. So first names got reused. So there was often more than one William or more than one John. And I think there was more than one Margaret. That was the reason you might need to refer to the list of names or make your own. Now, I do believe that the 14th century characters are based on real historical figures. In Daphne du Maurier's acknowledgements, she mentions several people helping her out at various public records offices and local history societies. And that, I think, is what drove the person who watches television through this book so quickly, because he is interested in local history. And I think this book would appeal to someone who was interested in medieval history or in local Cornish history. Regarding problematic content, while this is a fantastical situation in a lovely pastoral setting, and you would think what could possibly be threatening, underneath all that, this is the story of dangerous addictions. So it could be triggering if you have bad memories of dealing with an addict or overcoming an addiction. I did feel some resistance, not much, but some resistance to reading the book when I knew that one of the characters was going to lapse. That did make me edgy, but not enough so that I wanted to stop reading. But I could understand if someone might have a tough time with it at certain points in their life, especially if, those points in the book where the protagonist is going to let other people down because he's lapsing into addictive behavior, which is always very selfish. My rabbit hole today is quite special because what Meg and I agreed to do as part of our buddy read was we'd set each other a few questions to answer about the book. Now, we could comment on the book in addition to the questions, but we had to answer each other's questions for the buddy read. So what I'm going to do now is ask and answer Meg's questions to me regarding the house on the Strand. So this will feel a little bit more like a tag, which is kind of cool, I think. Now, question 1, she says, do you think Richard Young, who is the protagonist, loved his wife, Vita? And this was an excellent question, because it isn't as though you come to a conclusion, oh, yes or no. It wasn't that easy. Richard Young is English, and while the book doesn't say, I presume that he met Vita because he worked in the publishing industry and Vita's brother was also involved in publishing. It doesn't really say how they met. It does say that it seemed to have been a very quick romance, very quick marriage, and then for a while it was intense and passionate, and they've been married 3 years. And the book does say, I'm quoting page 260 now, it's Richard talking. He says, I did love Vita for moments shared during months and years, for all those ups and downs of married life that can be precious, exasperating, monotonous, and dear. I think he loved Vita during a time that happened before this novel starts, before the action in this novel starts. And what we're seeing about Richard and Vita as we read the book, I think is one of those transition periods in Richard's life more than Vita's. I think Vita knows what she wants and is quite consistent. But Richard he's broken away from one kind of life that maybe he thought would never end, his job in the publishing industry. And so I think when we meet him, he's having a bit of a midlife crisis, but a very understated one, because he's English, and I guess that's how we do those. He's trying to work out what is he going to be. And as it happens, in so many midlife crises, the man tries to recapture his youth in some fashion. And Richard does this by focusing on a long-term friendship that he's had with Dr. Magnus Lane, who he knew at Cambridge University, and they spent a lot of time together when they were younger. And it feels like he almost wants a little piece of time when he could be a young single man again with no other responsibilities or ties. That doesn't really answer the question, does it? I think he did love Vita. I think Vita worked for him. I'm not sure he and her really love each other as what they are. And perhaps that's because Richard hasn't settled on what am I. Maybe married Vita while that question was still up in the air. And now that he has to face it and has to answer it, what am I really? It's looking a little bit worrying as to whether what he is includes the kind of man who wants to stay married to Vita. And Meg's second question was about a character called Dr. Powell. And she says, what did you think of the character of the doctor? Was he provided as the voice of reason or the harbinger of doom? Well, this is a local doctor who happens to meet Richard Young on a couple of occasions, and he suspects. I don't know if he suspects that Richard is developing an addiction, but he certainly thinks there's something not right about him medically. Something you sense that Dr. Powell, if he had full freedom and wasn't a man to hold back and let people come to him first, you feel that he would have wanted to know what was going on with Richard at a much earlier point. Dr. Powell never hounds or pesters Richard, but when they talk, the doctor makes his concerns clear. Richard, of course, will see Dr. Powell as a harbinger of doom because the doctor is a threat to his continuing behavior, his continuing addictive behavior. And I won't go into details about that because that is a bit of a plot point. But I think, if I think of the other characters, how do they see Dr. Powell? They must hope that Dr. Powell knows what he's doing and can help Richard to get beyond the issues that he's having. And question 3, Meg asks me, was Magnus Lane a good guy or a bad guy? Now, Magnus Lane is Richard's childhood friend. When the novel opens, you learn that Magnus has offered Richard the use of his home down in Cornwall. It used to be Magnus's parents' home, but Magnus has inherited it, and Magnus uses it as a place to stay in the summer for holidays. He isn't staying there, so he says to Richard, you and Vita and the boys can stay there for the summer holidays, which is wonderful since Richard is between jobs. He could go spend a very long holiday there. There's a week during which Richard will be at the house alone. Vita and the boys are going to follow later. And Magnus kind of reveals to Richard, when he first arrives at the house, that Magnus has an ulterior motive for Richard spending time down there in that particular part of Cornwall. And, you know, when Dr. Powell, at the end of the novel, tells Richard the full consequences of what he's done, well, I couldn't help but think that Magnus ought to have known that. And if he knew that, and he was experimenting and using his friend as a guinea pig in that situation, well, then that seems extremely irresponsible. It does seem criminal to treat a friend this way. However, I guess the only reason I could justify Magnus behaving that way is that it seems that Magnus had the same problem, as best we can tell. I mean, I'm guessing because we never get more than just telephone conversations with Magnus. He doesn't appear as a person in this active in Cornwall in the story. Question 4. Meg, before I read her question, let me just say I don't think it's much of a spoiler to say that this novel has 2 storylines. It has one set in Cornwall in the present, i.e. around 1969, and one set in the same area of Cornwall back in 1330s, that sort of time. So you're in the same place, but you're in 2 different time periods. Now, Meg's question is, which storyline did I like better and why? Okay, let's talk about the differences between the 2 storylines. The 1969 storyline proceeds pretty much day by day. You never get any great gaps. You never leap forward 2 weeks or anything like that, except I think at the very end of the novel. However, the 1330s storyline is always making big jumps in time, and it usually takes you a little bit of time when you're first in the 1330s timeline. It usually takes you a little while to figure out, okay, roughly how far am I from the last time I read? How much time has passed since the last incident in this timeline? If anything, I thought, given the family tree and all that had to be worked out there, and then the places and where they were from each other, and so on, I felt that the 1330 storyline, you have to have a real delight in the past and its tiny details, I think, to enjoy the 1330s storyline. That's why I feel that it's ideal for people who are into local history and genealogy. That is, I think, why the person who watches television loved this book so much. I think it was that genealogical aspect of it. So it's going to appeal to a nerdy kind of reader, that 1330s timeline. If you don't feel that you're like that, then those are going to be the timeline bits where you think, I don't know where I am. I'm a little bit confused. I'd like to go back to 1969. So yeah, but one additional word too. If the 1330s timeline had moved day by day, well, first of all, you wouldn't have fit in all the things that Du Maurier wanted to fit in, because the 1330s timeline, she needed to hit upon certain dramatic events that took place over several years. So you have to leap forward, whereas the action in 1969 really only takes a few weeks, maybe three weeks at the most. So they have to run it differently than that. If the 1330s storyline were to slow down and try to go day by day, it would be extremely dull. I'm sure that for the most part in the 1330s, many days were like many other days. So what you did was you skipped forward in the 1330s to the most dramatic event of a certain point in time. And that is, if I was going to justify why does it jump around, I would say that's the reason it jumps around. And finally, Meg's 5th question went like this. It says, where does The House in the Strand stand in your ranking of Daphne du Maurier's work? Well, I've only read Rebecca. Meg is 1 book ahead of me. I think she's read Jamaica Inn. I've only read Rebecca. So that's a weird thing to judge The House on the Strand by, because those are different books in a way. There's still that sort of Daphne du Maurier, this isn't going to end well. You know, that seems to be her thing. And if somebody really loved Rebecca, I'm not sure I would say, oh, you'll automatically love The House on the Strand. You might find the switching between timelines a bit, I don't know. I put a question mark in the air, to anyone who's read Rebecca and you're now thinking, shall I read The House on the Strand? Try it. Try it. I was pulled along by it, but then I am a little bit of a nerd when it comes to history, so I did like all that detailed historical stuff. I did even enjoy having to write down the names and relationships of the characters. That appealed to me. I wouldn't imagine it appealing to every kind of reader. What I should have asked Meg, and I didn't think about this at the time, so Meg, I don't know if you have time to answer this question, but I was going to say, which would you rather? Would you rather have lived in the Kilmarsh house in Cornwall by yourself, which would have been very rural, or would you have preferred to be with Vita in New York City, where she wanted to be? Which kind of person were you? Because I wasn't certain myself. While it was true that Kilmarsh was utterly beautiful, and I would definitely stay in a house like that for a holiday by myself. Yes, a few weeks of all that peace and quiet, and naturally I'd pack a lot of books. It would be a very productive reading time, or maybe I'd download books to my Kindle app. It doesn't really matter which. But to live there, my experience of tiny rural neighborhoods in England is that they get a bit claustrophobic. And it isn't always good to, you can't, the friends that you have are the ones that you can have. You don't get much choice in the matter. And you pretty much are left to get on with people that you might not naturally get on with. And rural places, amazingly, they're not necessarily sympathetic to bookish types of people, unless you just happen to have other bookish types nearby, but mostly people value things more practical, I think, in the countryside, because you need to be more self-sufficient, you're more isolated. Saying all that, New York City, again, could only do a holiday there, and then I think I would be overwhelmed by the people and the traffic and all that. That would be really tough. I would need to get to some kind of rural space here and there. Even if I stayed in New York for a holiday, I'd have to get away from the city, I'd say, about every 2 to 3 days, or I'd go crazy. So I'm not a big city person either. I seem to be somewhere in the middle. I like a smaller town, or lesser known, I guess we'd still call it a city. I don't know what qualifies as a city. In England, it's if you have a cathedral, then you get to be a city. So there are lots of smaller towns in England. They're not villages. They're not really isolated. They're slightly larger. They have some shops and facilities so that you don't necessarily have to go to the city. And that's the kind of size that I personally prefer. And that's the review done. So there's not much in my description box. There may be a link to Meg's video. There will also be a link to the Cornish National Party website if you're curious as to what is this party doing right now, what does it want, etc., if that's your thing. The only thing I'm going to say is, before I close off, is there's going to be another video posted today, which is unprecedented for me. It's twice a week and that's it for me. But I'm going to do an extra video, and that is I need to fix a little miscommunication that happened when I posted my Secret Santa tag, right? Just a tiny little thing, which I will explain in that video. So look out for another very short, I don't know, probably 5 to 7 minute video, which is specifically almost a gift to one person, as a way of saying, whoops, yeah, we could have done that a bit better. So look out for that. In the meantime, I hope your reading is going really well, and I hope you're managing to juggle that with all the demands of the holiday season, if those demands are great upon you. And see you again in, well, probably a few minutes' time, but after that, in a few days' time. Okay? Anyway, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.